what was your reaction when you saw it? And on a wider point, what should we now be doing collectively, whether you're black, whether you're white? What should we do to try and stop this kind of thing happening as we go forward?
Good morning. Well, first of all, obviously, I was horrified as well, like any human being would be looking at an event like that. However, we have to look at the wider issues as to why things like this should allow to happen. Now, of course, in an overtly racist event like this, we can all, say how terrible it is. But this is just symptomatic of a wider problem that we have in the disenfranchisement of black people generally, in terms of the how we feel intellectually, morally about them. Because if you ask that policeman, Derek Chauvin, whether he thinks he's racist, he will say it's not, because he's married to an Asian woman. So, and Amy Cooper, you saw the woman who were fought in the police against the man in Central Park. She's a white liberal Obama supporter. We believe that racists are just people like Derek Chauvin or white supremacists. The feeling of a negative hierarchical perception of black people comes from the brightest minds, philosophers who have hundreds of years told us that black people are inferior, and it pervades all of society. So this is an obvious one whereby we can get behind and feel horrified. But how do we feel about inequality in the inner cities? Black people not being given jobs, things that you can't prove. We can't pass laws to change this. So of course this is an obvious one, and we're all horrified by it. And we feel that after this event, we'll wait for another event to happen to jump on the bandwagon and see how terrible it is. This is an ongoing fight against racism.
Well, I want to play, John, I want to play a clip from Martin Luther King that went viral yesterday. And he was a remarkable man in many ways. But this was a brilliant, I thought, assessment of the roots behind a lot of the problem. Let's watch this. Justin Finlayson, when you watch that, and I've watched a lot of Martin Luther King, he was a remarkable guy in many ways. But when you watch that, there's the history right there that has caused, I think, a lot of the resentment, which has never been tackled properly. When you watch the protests about what's happened to George Floyd, what do you think of the protests this time? They're on the biggest scale in America, apparently since Martin Luther King was assassinated, way bigger than even after what happened to Rodney King. What do you think of these protests? And in particular, should we be disseminating between the peaceful protesters and the ones who are looting, rioting, using violence? Or is it all part of a justified reaction?
Well, the protest itself, it's a continuum. It's the same racial violence that's been around since Dr. King was alive till now. And it's interesting that you mentioned Dr. King. We also have to remember that this is a man that was actually quite hated when he was alive and doing the work that he was doing. When Dr. King was having dogs set on him and his fellow his fellow members, it was almost seen as if he was just rabble rousing. Like, why all this trouble in the streets, And it's poignant that we are in the same position we are today, because conditions haven't moved on a great deal.
I mean, in this pandemic, before what happened to George Floyd, we were already seeing people from BAME communities being unfairly targeted, if for want of a better phrase, by the virus. More people dying from those communities than proportionate to the population, both here and in America. We're seeing mass unemployment now, 40 million in America, many people who'll be unemployed, and the hardest hit, again, will be BAME communities, no question. And then you see the appalling discrimination which led to the death of George Floyd. You put all this together, and this is a terrible time for BAME communities. What should white people be doing to help, to actually properly help? I would like to know what can be materially helpful, rather than just saying, isn't this awful?
Well, the very first thing I'd suggest is we're witnessing a modern-day lynching. And as lynchings go, people were given the day off school and the day off work to go and witness a lynching. Here we have a black man being killed, and it's being paraded everywhere. There's no thought of the impact it can have on, black community in particular. Seeing someone that looks exactly like them being killed in broad daylight, I'd suggest that I've literally seen at the beginning of this show, you use the image of a dead man on the floor again. I can't tell you when I've ever seen an image of a dead, white person. I think it will be handled with a lot more sensitivity. A dead black person, however, I'm becoming almost numb. I'm almost desensitized to seeing dead black people, week in, week out on television. The main thing we have to do from a media standpoint is look at people's well-being and understand and appreciate that a lot of people don't actually want to see this. It's very insensitive to highlight and show this every few seconds.
When I've watched the reaction to these three things, funny enough, the story that John Barnes mentioned about this woman in Central Park, in many ways, that was as bad as any of the deaths that I've seen, because what it highlighted to me was that her instinctive reaction was to categorise a very polite black man telling her to do the right thing, tether her dog, which was unleashed in Central Park. Her reaction was to call the authorities and to paint him as a potential killer, to say that she was feeling threatened for her life. And when I watched that,
and
I've got
identifying him as an African-American
an African-American man is threatening me and my dog. And when I watched that, I wouldn't say the penny dropped, because when I was in America at CNN, I covered many of these stories, from Trayvon Martin to others, and I found them all horrific. But it was the way that she did that, this privileged white woman from a top firm in America, the way she was prepared to paint this guy who did nothing wrong as a potential killer. In that moment, I understand what you had said to me before about sometimes we don't, as white people, we may not even see that kind of thing, or why it is so insidious.
That's right. I mean, it's what I would call weaponizing whiteness against black people. And this is not new to us at all. And I think the reason for this is because fundamentally people don't understand what racism is. The fact that it is a systemic power construct to deny an equal value of life and liberty to black people for the benefit of white people. And it means that white people get a privilege from that. That white privilege means that they are treated favorably in comparison to people of color. So I would always say that in this discussion, the discourse, the fight, the equality for black people, it is so important to understand that racism is not just hate, that this systemic racism is entrenched in society. That's why white folks need to exercise their privilege to stop racism perpetrated by other white people and by institutions. And even well-meaning, white allies who say, you know what, I'm not racist, who say, I don't see color. I don't see color is a problem, because if you don't see color, you don't see me. And if you don't see me, you cannot possibly see the abuse I get because of the color of my skin.
I assume there's a lot of this going on that we don't see on mobile phone now. And the question then is, when you see these protests in America on this scale, what do you feel? Barack Obama has come out and said, please don't loot, don't be violent, don't burn buildings. Martin Luther King was a very peaceful man. He always advocated violence begets violence, hatred begets hate. Don't do that. What do you feel about the protesters? Because millions are protesting peacefully, but some are clearly looting, arsoning, and so on. What do you think about that?
To be honest, I think that's a reflection of the governments across the world, especially the UK and the USA. They're founded on violence, founded on conquest, subjugation of black people and marginalised people across the world. So this is reflective of how people are feeling, and this is what is demonstrated by the governments across the world. And these conquests are fueled by violence. And I think, to be honest, this is not just about white privilege, this is about white ignorance. This is about ignoring what black people have been saying for years. And we've protested in a peaceful manner. We've tried to do the right things, and things have just been destroyed. The Black Panther movement destroyed. Civil rights movement pretty much destroyed. And there's been a war on black people for as long as I can remember, centuries. And the fact is that this is orchestrated systemic racism towards black people. And yet when we say...
I think I apologise for interrupting, but I think you make such an important point about ignorance, about your experience. Yes. And I'm just looking at the notes about what you have experienced, even during lockdown.
Yes.
How many times have you been stopped and searched in your life? And how many times have you been stopped and searched during this lockdown?
So I've been stopped and searched over 30 times in my life. I was assaulted by a police officer at the age of 14, just going home from school on the train from Gypsy Hill. And he asked me to get off the train, and I asked him what was the reason, and then he assaulted me. Me and my mother took it to court, but the CPS threw it out through lack of evidence, even though we had CCTV footage and eyewitness accounts. So that is the injustice that fueled my kind of disdain towards the police.
And then you've experienced that, not the assault, but you've experienced us being stopped 30 times in your lifetime. And how old are you, if you don't mind me asking? Sorry.
37. I'm 37. I've been stopped 4 times during lockdown. The well-documented one, I filmed the end of the experience with the police. And the fact of the matter is that we've had enough. And the fact is, we've been asking for you guys to understand from our point of view and listen to us, but you don't. And I think if white people approach racism and say have coronavirus, racism would be null and void.